Just after 2 p.m., police responded to State and Carrillo.
It was an incident that shattered lives and shook a community. On March 14th of 2007, Luis Angel Linares, a gregarious 15-year-old Santa Barbara student, lost his life in a gang brawl in the middle of the day in the middle of downtown Santa Barbara. In its wake, the incident left a 14-year-old destined for prison and a community reeling, trying to make sense of it all.
I think it scared the community and really shook the community. You know, as being, you know, small community that we are, how could this happen here? How can we allow this as adults and as a community to happen? And I think that really began worrying people. And you know, safety was that question. You know, are my kids at risk?
Well, I was concerned for my own kids, for my own young adults, and that they wouldn't end up like him.
It really opened up our eyes that this wasn't violence that was new, but it was moving from different parts of town to other parts of town. And we finally figured out as a community that it was no longer appropriate for us just to sit back.
The Linares murder changed more than the lives of those involved. It changed public sentiment. Whether it was because of the young age of the kids involved, the brutality of the act, or the heart of the city location, people began to realize the issue wasn't just a personal one, it was a public one too. The tragedy became a clarion call to address the problem of youth violence as a community.
If you think about, you know, what it takes for anyone to be successful, it's not just about being in a safe neighborhood, that's part of it. It's also about having job opportunities into the future, you know, having a sense of hope and ways to get ahead. There's so many different components in someone's individual life that makes that whole person work that you really need to focus on what does it take for that each individual kid to be successful.
But one thing that vexed many in the community at the time was the fact that there wasn't a shortage of services targeting kids considered at risk.
It was found that there was a lot of silos. There was a lot of good programs, but they were only working within the boundaries of their program. And so the goal was really to break those silos down and create more partnerships.
We were a bunch of different organized groups who were connected to youth who needed assistance, but we weren't connected to each other. And for example, the school district not knowing what probation was doing, the city's park and recreation department not necessarily knowing all the details behind the sheriff's department work, or organizations' social service groups.
In response to that need for connectivity and coordination, in 2008 the city spearheaded an effort to bring all the youth programs together to attempt to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts.
Collaboration and partnerships is really, you know, 1 + 1 = 3, creating those partnerships. It's not just to give and it's not just to take, but really sharing resources, sharing information, sharing the responsibility of who addresses this is important. I think so within those partnerships, you know, it's creating that trust.
After months of meetings, the group of over 40 stakeholders recommended that a regional effort be established to maximize the use of available resources based on the following principles. 1. Target services to youth actively involved with or at risk of becoming involved with gangs. 2. Employ prevention, intervention, and suppression strategies coupled with client-specific assessment and services. 3. Work to achieve more coordination and partnerships. Assign outreach workers in the schools to work with males and females and include family services. 4. Secure reliable funding for a long-term strategy that focuses on successful programs that can be evaluated. 5. Be risk-takers, recognizing that there will be successes and failures, but doing nothing should never be an option. And 6. Be patient. Problems did not arrive and will not be solved overnight. But this new regional effort needed coordination and continuity. To accomplish that, the South Coast Task Force on Youth Gangs was formed.
The task force was created, and the coordinator position, which I now work for, was created to lead this effort and to really bring the partners throughout the South Coast together and work on this.
Each of us as electeds, we have jurisdiction and authority over one component of what makes a community whole. And so what the task force does, it allows us to focus on what we can do while also then communicating with our colleagues in other elected capacities on what they are focusing on, and let each of us work on our strength and then fill in the gaps where needed.
With a unified team assembled, a comprehensive plan in place, and coordinator ready for action, the last piece of the puzzle was funding. Recognizing that no single local government could fund the effort, the county and South Coast cities agreed to share the administrative cost.
They're partner funders, and they fund the task force on an annual basis per capita, meaning that based on population rates for each municipality, they provide funds that go into a pot. And the overall task force is administered by the Community Action Commission as a neutral entity, provides the oversight for this effort in the South Coast.
But the task force's job was to act as coordinator and convener, not provide the actual services. So funds for that aspect were needed too. As a result of the investment in coordination, in 2009, the city of Santa Barbara received a $400,000 grant from the state to serve youth on the South Coast. But that grant required funds to be matched. By establishing new partnerships with the provider community, the task force was able to cobble together the match, allowing state money to fund youth programs on the South Coast. With the 6 principals as a guide and the task force as a coordinating resource, the schools, law enforcement, probation, and a cadre of youth-centered programs got to work. Tactics in the overall strategy ran the gamut from counseling to parental education and involvement to treating kids in a completely different way at school.
You know, in our country, late 80s into the 90s, we really took a zero tolerance approach. And that doesn't work. In the Santa Barbara Unified School District, we're going to work to keep our students here in our district. And so if a student is, for lack of a better term, at risk, we're going to do everything we can to serve them, to keep them enrolled in our high schools, our junior high schools. So what that did was, with the exception of students who were expelled, we kept them in the district.
When school professionals treated them as individuals, so not like, oh, well, they did that crime and they do this time, but okay, they did this crime, and why did they do that crime, and what factors led to that, and what interests do they have, and let's get them involved in some art classes, or let's get them into this treatment, and that made a huge difference.
I worked a lot in this area when I was the police chief down south. And I became absolutely convinced that most young people were looking for an excuse to do the right thing. And those kind of prevention programs make that happen.
To communicate more effectively, especially with parents, educators and service providers learn to become more culturally proficient.
They use this word called los compadres. And in the Mexican community, if I go to your home and knock on your door and I say I'm your son's counselor, you're not going to be welcomed into my home, because we see counseling as a sign of weakness for the most part. But if you came to my house and you knock on the door and you said, I'm your son's compadre, that word means a lot to me. It means that you're going to raise my child if something happens to me. It means that you're going to be there to support my child. So I'm not only going to welcome you into the home, but I'm probably going to ask you to eat. I'm going to want to serve you food before you leave. It's a relationship issue.
And key to the success and sustainability of the program, data collection, evaluation, and sharing have also been added to the system.
Not only data to evaluate, but data to inform practice. So we'd use an assessment to see, does this kid need mental health treatment? Do they need substance use treatment? Do they need skills development? And then placing them in programs that can do that.
Judging from the data, the new approach is having an impact.
We've seen a decrease from 254 youth in 2009 who were on probation with gang terms and conditions, all the way down to 62 youth in 2015 who were on gang terms and conditions in the juvenile probation.
We have seen a drop in the number of suspensions and the number of expulsions. And so in terms of that data, we are seeing positive results. And that to us is the important piece, because if a student's not in class, they're not learning.
But the task force can't afford to rest on its laurels. It has to constantly prove its effectiveness while at the same time not become a victim of its own success.
It comes down to having proper evaluation. So when something's working, we can prove that it's working and then take it to government agencies and say, look, we have outcomes. This works. This needs to be funded, because it's always a struggle for what gets funded.
As we're seeing great success, the number of youth in at-risk conditions are declining. The number of youth who have probation terms and conditions are at an all-time low. We can't just give up and just say, we're done. This is an ongoing commitment. And just to remember that continual effort is what is making success happen.
Going forward, the now renamed South Coast Task Force on Youth Safety is striving to build on their success. With its strong cohesion, unified vision, and dedicated coordination, the task force as a whole is determined to keep innovating and adapting to the changing needs of the youth in our community, so that no child is lost to senseless violence again, and everyone has an opportunity to realize their potential.
I always knew that there was a potential to one day lose a student, but when it happens, it really shocks you, and I think it really, it gets the best of you. And now being a witness of all this work, that the community at large is doing, has been very motivating to see that, from tragedies, there's a lot of lessons learned, and there's a lot of positivity that comes from that as well.
Most of these young people do not want to do violence. Most of these young people do not want to hurt other people. What they want is to get by and live their life. And too often they don't see any other choices. Part of the role of the task force, part of the role of, I think, us as a society is to say there are other choices.
Without the community, really, it would just be tragic, because I just think that so many young lives would be lost, not just physically lost in terms of gang violence and or violence and death, but also lost in the sense that they would put themselves further into the juvenile justice system and be lost in that regard in terms of who their identity is, right? And being associated as a criminal or a probationer instead of being, seen for the value and the worth that they are. You're a human being, you are life, we value you, we value your future, and we want to invest in that.